Thank you very much, Louise, and good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted and grateful to you, everybody, for joining us this morning for the launch of our thematic inspection on the delivery of unpaid work. Um, Now, we've got the inspectors that led this inspection that will talk you through the details of what we found as part of our inspection, but it might be helpful to sort of set it in context for people. For me, unpaid work is absolutely the front, shop window of the probation service, stuff that the public will understand immediately as something which is people carrying out orders of the court and repaying local communities. I have to say, we were really impressed with the progress that has been made in unpaid work. It was a really positive inspection that we undertook. And whilst we identified areas for improvement, what we saw really strongly in this was, first of all, an improvement in the overall level of delivery, and in particular, a reduction in the backlog of unpaid work that had increased during COVID. What we also saw in this was picking out the value of unpaid work, both for people on probation, but also for local communities. We certainly think, given the fact that the sentencing review, which is currently underway with David Gauke looking at the options for future reform, thought that unpaid work has huge potential in the future as a work at the heart of the work of the probation service. Can I have the next slide, please? So just to say a few words about the inspectorate. Obviously, our job and our vision is to drive high quality probation and youth justice services that change people's lives for the better. And obviously, we shine a light on the quality and impact of those services. And our work is driven by evidence-based judgments and guidance. And we seek to use our voice to drive improvements. Can I have the next slide, please? I think I'm now going to pass over to David to start talking through the findings of the thematic. Thanks, David.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Thank you very much. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm David Miners, and I led the unpaid work inspection, which took place over the summer and autumn last year. I'm going to be giving an overview here alongside Helen Cox, who is my deputy, and then we've also got contributions from User Voice, who undertook a lot of work and undertook an extensive survey and focus groups. And we've also got Helen Moore, who will be talking about the effective practice, which we highlighted and produced in a report and also published. As Martin's just said, I found it a really, really interesting inspection, and I know the team found it very interesting as well. And I was supported by a very, very strong team. They say that the best oysters have grit in them, and I think our team certainly had grit in it. And I think the report and the inspection is evidence of that. What I'll do is I'll go through slides on some of our findings and the background to the inspection, and then Helen will talk about the placements and the recommendations. But what I'd like to say for those who are online who were involved in the inspection and involved in setting it up, thanks again. It was a really positive experience from our point of view. Okay, so why did we do this inspection? In terms of unpaid work, as Martin has just highlighted, is a really, really key, important part of probation service delivery, and it therefore requires to be reviewed by the inspectorate. We hadn't looked at it since 2016, and during the period since we'd undertaken that inspection in 2016, there have been some significant changes, not least of which was the unification, but also the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously had a significant impact on unpaid work delivery. So therefore, we felt a pertinent time to look at it. I mean, it is our responsibility to look at the effectiveness of community penalties. I mean, in the context of this inspection was also the prison crisis. You had SDS 40 being undertaken at the time of our inspection. You've had also the sentencing review, which was obviously announced after our inspection was announced, but hopefully some of the findings which we've undertaken will feed into that review. But it's a very pertinent time to be looking at the balance between community and community penalties and imprisonment. So it was a good time to undertake this inspection. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of methodology, we went to 5 English regions. Didn't go to all the English regions. I think that bullet might be a bit misleading. And we went to Wales, which of course is a country in its own. In terms of the work we undertook 91 focus groups with various members of staff, all staff levels and senior staff. We undertook 24 unpaid work placement observations, and those included placements at weekends. And I've got to say, from a personal point of view, as someone who in the days of community service undertook remember supervising groups in cemeteries cutting grass, it was good to actually directly observe that my practice I'm not too much of a dinosaur, because I still saw similar activities being undertaken as part of unpaid work now. In terms of user voice, who will no doubt be talking about that themselves in when they come to their part, but they had undertook an extensive survey and an extensive number of focus groups and had a really positive number of responses. We also undertook our own staff survey. We had a positive response, 414. And in terms of the cases we looked at most multi-requirement orders and standalone orders. We looked at 90 across the 5 regions in Wales, and we undertook a qualitative approach, very much so, in terms of looking and trying to understand issues with an emphasis on illustrating wider findings and finding themes. Obviously, we also have able to make reference to our own core inspection data, because they undertake some inspection of unpaid work. Okay, if we go on to the next slide then, please, Holly. Just some basic contextual facts. Well, and we took this from some key points in time. Over 6 million hours worked between April 23 and 24. That's a significant amount of hours. That's the number of hours imposed. In terms of actual fact, I think the numbers actually were 4,668,000 thereabouts. I mean, that's still a significant amount of work being undertaken within the community. 40,000, over 40,000 requirements on the caseload in July 24. The number of women on the caseload is 9%, unpaid work caseload that is, and 95%. That's the level of unpaid work delivery against a pre-COVID-19 baseline. One of the targets has been is to get unpaid work back to the pre-COVID level of work. What the pre-COVID baseline is actually 98,605 hours per week. So when in July this year, they were at 95% of that. 7%, we'll be talking a bit, I'll be making reference to the backlog again. That is the level of the backlog when we ended the inspection in September. And just to be clearer, a case in the backlog is defined if it is over 12 months into the unpaid work requirement. There is no active extension in place, and it is not currently subject to a warrant or a breach. So we'll talk a bit more about that, but it got down to 7%. The target is to get it to below 2% by the 31st of March this year. Okay, so that gives you some context. Let's move on to findings. If we go to the next slide, if that's okay, Holly, thanks very much. I mean, what we found was that both regional and national level, there was a clear focus on improving performance in unpaid work. Understandably, the focus was on the backlog. And what we'd found was that this had reduced from its peak of 30% in 2022, and it had gone down to 7%, as I said at the time of the inspection. I think that is significant when you think of the number of cases which are also coming on. Although there's been a reduction in the number of cases, requirements being made, that's still a significant achievement given the level in backlog and then the constant churn of cases being added to the caseload. At national level, we found the Community Payback Board and the national team provided strategic direction and had produced targeted performance criteria and data metrics to support this. And we found, although there's a dotted line, it isn't a direct line of accountability between the national and the regional teams. We did think that this had been very effective in terms of the data sets that have been worked and in terms of that relationship, in terms of making sure there was focus on unpaid work performance and improvement. The national team and the Community Payback Board also had oversight of the additional £93 million of funding which had come out of the spending review in 2021, and the Treasury had provided this money with the clear direction to obviously address performance and to improve the number of hours being worked and return it to the pre-COVID levels. The money was used, amongst other things, to underpin the work of the national team, but also provided additional staff in the regions and improved some of the facilities such as unpaid work vehicles as well. So that's how the money was done. And the Community Payback Board had oversight of that. In terms of in the probation regions, what we found is they had, under this focus of improving unpaid work, they had very effective accountability frameworks, and these were being used to monitor performance and to address the areas for improvement. They were using not all of it. I think it'd be fair to say a lot of the region said some of the national work was directly relevant, some of it they didn't find it so useful, but they were certainly using a lot of the performance metrics which were provided in a very comprehensive fashion, I've got to say, by the national team to improve their performance. And some of those metrics, such as use of the dormancy data, were clearly influential and driving that performance improvement in terms of reducing that backlog. Like I said, increasing staff numbers was part of the drive to improve performance and part of this spending review money from the Treasury. And over 500 staff had been recruited nationally, but it was quite clear that recruitment and retention challenges remained. And in terms of the national recruitment drives, and some have been moved to the local, there have been some issues in terms of retention and in terms of the recruitment of staff. I mean, the recruitment and retention challenges remain particularly in the south of England, which isn't surprising maybe, because that tends to be the same for probation practitioners as well. But even within those areas where there were staffing problems, we did still find that was not used as an excuse not to drive performance. I mean, I will highlight South Central here, if they don't mind. They were operating with only 50% of unpaid work supervisors in post, and they were still improving their performance, and that was impressive. In terms of generally that level, the retention of particularly unpaid work supervisors was a challenge, and I think that's related to some of our other findings around training. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, please. Areas for improvement in terms of leadership and strategy. I'll be coming back to this, but the performance of sentence management standalone teams, it was quite clear that there was a discrepancy between the performance in relation to unpaid requirements between sentence management teams managing multi-requirement orders and standalone teams managing standalone teams. And although there had been an improved focus and partly run by the regional accountability boards as well, within sentence management teams on unpaid work delivery and had improved, they still were not matching the performance of standalone teams. It was evidence, for example, in the number of incomplete unpaid work requirements on suspended sentence orders, and also in terms of enforcement decisions. And although I think it's fair to say it's more likely that cases that multi-requirement orders had more complex cases, we did not think this alone accounted for the contrast in performance. And similarly, we didn't think that it was an issue just around capability of the centre's management practitioners, or indeed an absence of management oversight. In our view, that discrepancy highlighted the operational tension in centres management teams between adopting a proactive approach to public protection on the wider caseload and overseeing unpaid work requirements. And of course, that proactive approach for public protection is something we expect, and is partly driven particularly by some of the serious case reviews, but also driven by the findings in the core inspection programme by HM Inspectorate of Probation, so I acknowledge that. We also had concerns about the training for supervisors. That we found they had inconsistent training in key areas such as management of anger and aggression. And the profile of the unpaid work caseload was that 13% nationally, in some regions it was up to 20%, but 13% nationally, the national average, were assessed as risk of harm, serious harm, and also that obviously a significant number of those cases are medium risk of serious harm as well. In terms of offences, I'm in the regions we asked this question, most offences were for violent offences. So it's really important that supervisors who are spending hours, 7 hours, up to 7 hours a day with people, have the appropriate training in terms of managing that, and particularly in areas like in terms of anger and aggression. And we did hear of incidents when supervisors were left on their own dealing with those situations, and in the main they had the resources to manage it, but they do need the input of good training. In terms of the training for placement coordinators, we also found that to be inconsistent as well, and that's particularly relevant in terms of my next point in terms of assessment. The assessment process, it's important that placement coordinators have the right training to undertake their role. In terms of unpaid work quality assurance arrangements, we also found this is an area for improvement as well. What I would say around that, I think the focus understandably has been on performance, and in terms of getting that backlog down and getting people through the caseload. Now that it's more under control, I think it's recognised both nationally and regionally that the focus does need now to be on to the quality assurance arrangements. Aspects of unpaid work delivery, such as the structure of the working day, were under review, and they were under review so that staff supervision could be supported, and also quality assurance activity. So I think that is recognised as an issue for development. And obviously from the point of view, and given the nature of what delivery is, it's really important that quality assurance activity in terms of the performance of supervisors, but also in terms of the work being undertaken, that quality assurance is embedded within the working practices and operational structure. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. Thanks, Holly. One area we did look at was assessment and commencement, and then we looked at this within the cases, and also we spoke to staff about it. And what we found was that the drive for performance meant that most unpaid work assessments were being completed before the first work session, and we also found that requirements were commencing promptly. I guess the issue was around the quality of those assessments and the information that was available. The digital assessment tool, which had been introduced to expedite the assessment process so that individuals could start their work promptly, we often found was incomplete, and with risk and information not absent. Obviously, the placement coordinators use that to make their placements. So what we found in not just one region, in several regions, was placement coordinators were then undertaking their own inquiries to get that information. I think that process really needs to be reviewed. we understand, and I support you need to have an expedited start to unpaid work requirements, but there also needs to make sure that where possible, all the information is gathered before the initial placement is made, and also when information comes in after work starts, that's integrated into the assessment and in terms of the planning of the activity for that individual. Certainly, we also found that, and I'm sure any practitioners online will recognise this, that for a lot of cases also required an OASIS assessment. So you have this sort of parallel assessment process running. The digital assessment tool was unable to be updated, so it had to have a new one if you were going to amend it or change it. But we didn't find really any cross-fertilization between the digital assessment tool and then the OASIS when it was completed in terms of providing assessment information. So I think that process does need to review. In terms of inductions, we found that, and we observed several inductions. These were taking place prior to the commencement of the unpaid work placement, but we did find that their structure and quality varied. I think what I would say is in terms of the most effective inductions we saw involved active engagement with the individuals, the clear communication of expectations, and details of the first work session being given to the individual before they leave of their first work session before they leave that induction session. I mean, in some places we even saw them being taken out to work on their first placement as part of the induction day, which obviously is ideal practice. But we know that was our observation of inductions. Okay, if we go on to the next slide, please. In terms of the delivery of unpaid work then, for most cases, we found the arrangements were sufficient to enable the completion of the unpaid work requirement, notwithstanding what I've said about the assessment process. And we also found that the enforcement of unpaid work requirements had improved, but inconsistencies remained. And some of those inconsistencies were in relation to standalone requirements and multi-requirement orders. And of course, that relates to standalone teams and centres management teams. At the same time, we did find signs of improved performance and an improved working culture between sentence management and unpaid work staff. I mean, although a repeated theme of throughout the regions was that unpaid work staff felt somewhat like the Cinderella of the service was how they're described themselves, and that was a theme. There had in other regions been a lot of focus on improving those relationships, and that had an impact, those initiatives. At the same time, I think in terms of the working arrangements and in terms of the performance, there were still clear discrepancies. What we did find was that where automatic breach proceedings had been brought in, these had improved breach practice, even though there were some tensions amongst the staff about, particularly amongst sentence management staff, around them losing their responsibility for decision making. At the same time, we saw these as very positive. And what that meant was it was normally unpaid work staff who made the decision around breaching the requirement, even in multi-requirement orders, or made the recommendation. And in some regions, we also saw that linked where automatic enforcement came in, it was linked to an improvement in terms of compliance of the orders, so that where people knew exactly where they stood, there was an increase in compliance. In one PDU, we saw an increase of 10% in compliance rates following the imposition of automatic breach enforcement. So we see that as a very positive thing. In terms of unpaid work placements, we recognise that there needs to be a range of placements. Some need to be non-skilled, some need to be bespoke for women, etc. And what we found in terms of the placements is that generally they did not support an individual's employability. So there was we saw a lot of unskilled placements, and Helen will talk a bit more about that in a minute. But what we did find, and User Voice will probably be talking about this, so I don't want to steal their thunder, but there was a really positive impact in terms of the soft skills, in terms of individuals' confidence, in terms of trust, in terms of people in authority, in terms of team working skills. And we saw that as a real positive in this inspection. We also saw really good relationships between unpaid work staff and the individuals. And within that, we saw unpaid work staff being very professional, providing very, very good role models. And I don't think it's pushing the envelope to say they were presenting role models to which the individuals under their supervision were able to identify. At the same time, I don't want to brush over. I am aware that within some areas there was still the residue of employment cultures and work cultures which had come over from the TR days, and that organisations and regions still were still facing the consequences of that and dealing with the consequences of that. But what we saw in most regions was very positive in terms of our placement observations. One area which we did want to highlight was that this, and I guess this goes back to the culture we were talking about in terms of there were improvements in terms of unpaid work being integrated into the probation service generally, but there was still some evidence of silo working, and this was particularly in relation to risk management. What we found was that the potential role of unpaid work staff in risk management information, and indeed the risk management information they received, was underestimated. The arrangements for ensuring unpaid work supervisors had information were of concern. Communication methods were inconsistent, and the information available frequently was insufficient. And this is despite, don't forget, the high number of high or medium risk of harm people on probation under their supervision, and also despite the fact that they had several MAPA. You know, a lot of these will be subject to MAPA cases. I mean, I think I'm right in saying there's been an increase in the number of Category 1 MAPA offenders on unpaid work. And it was interesting from our point of view that there was no evidence of unpaid work staff being involved in terms of MAPA arrangements, in terms of MAPA reviews, either at level 1 or level 2. And obviously, given the amount of time they spend with individuals, they are a key source of information, both in terms of monitoring attitudes, relationships, and indeed behaviour. So we saw that as an omission and an area for improvement. In terms of people on probation, like we said, we found that they highly valued their relationships with unpaid work supervisors, and we saw good evidence of that. Okay, if we just move on to the next slide, then just in terms of the delivery model, you won't be surprised in what I'm saying. We do think this should be reviewed, particularly in terms of multi-requirement orders, and I know some regions are already doing that. The operation, although the operational culture has improved, it's still the responsibilities when they sit just with practitioners for those multi-requirement orders means that unpaid work, we don't think, is being prioritised like it should be. And let's be frank, an unpaid work requirement does involve a lot of work, particularly when it goes wrong, particularly when there's sickness, absences having to be monitored, particularly when re-engagement needs to take place, particularly when you've got issues on placements where staff need, where individuals need warnings, etc. So what we think is the model of particularly for managing multi-requirement orders does need to be changed, and we do know some regions are doing that. In terms of one area of where we saw some positive developments, and this was within within Wales, where the human factors models had been adapted for unpaid work in Wales. And this was quite interesting because, to be honest, I was involved in the SPO inspection last year, which also highlighted that unpaid work, not unpaid work, that human factors was having a positive impact on working culture. I mean, what is positive about it is it's realistic. The approach is realistic about the nature of the caseload. It doesn't assume compliance. It doesn't assume there won't be a crisis. It's like planning for a crisis. In Wales, they had adapted it. They hadn't adopted the centres management model. They realised that wasn't practical, but they had adapted it. And what we found was a lot of enthusiasm from particularly supervisors about how the model was working. It seemed to improve staff confidence. It helped develop a more cohesive operational culture, and there was significantly key an improved sharing of information amongst supervisors. And this included significantly key risk information, both within supervisors, but then being communicated to centres management teams as well. So we saw that as a positive. Okay, I think I've probably said what I need to say. It's probably something now which I'll remember. I might come in later and add some more, but I will hand over to Helen now, who can take you through the placements and the recommendations. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, David. As David mentioned, my name's Helen Cox, and I was working with David as the deputy lead on this particular thematic. We'll all be aware on the call that punishment is the primary purpose of unpaid work requirements, but there is very often an education and training need for those that are made subject to unpaid work, and we felt therefore that it was appropriate that ETE was incorporated into the requirement wherever suitable. Online ETE provision was a really important way for the service to deliver hours throughout the pandemic. And beyond that, that is now done via the Community Campus portal, where people can access a variety of online qualifications and certificates to complete. However, the vocational courses that are available on that portal are not accredited. There are limitations around those courses. And as David's mentioned, there was minimal evidence that they actually contributed to an increased level of employability for those that participated. So whilst online ETE has helped to address the backlog of unpaid work delivery, for it to be a credible feature of this requirement and for it to not undermine the purposes of unpaid work, what we felt was that it needs to be more targeted and have the express purpose of improving employability for the individual. It was positive to note that the shortcomings of that online provision were recognised nationally and that there are plans in place to address this as contracts come up for renewal. But currently the use of online learning was not sufficiently targeted to the skills and potential aims and ambitions of an individual on probation. And it was too often used as just a way of completing hours, a bit of a tick box exercise. So our recommendation, really, I'll come on to that shortly, is that it needs to be more carefully supervised and targeted to the individual. And just 1 in 10 people on probation completed the maximum allowance of 30% of their unpaid work hours through ETE. So the use of that provision was also not being maximised. As a team of inspectors, we did note some concerns in relation to digital illiteracy amongst the cohort, not always having the skills to be able to complete online learning in a meaningful way. And even more fundamental to that, some inequity of access to things such as equipment, laptops and phones, for example, and Wi-Fi, data, and in some instances even electricity to be able to charge something and access these courses. We did see some efforts in regions to provide access to laptops at induction, get people set up on the portal and support them in navigating some of that. But overall, that inequity remains, and it is a concern for people completing unpaid work. Can I have the next slide, please, Holly? In some regions, we did see some really positive links having been made to try and boost the offer a little bit by making links with local employers and colleges to deliver some accredited vocational training as part of unpaid work requirements. And that gave people who participated some meaningful and tangible certification to take away into their onward employment journey. However, what we did feel was that the potential for unpaid work to deliver meaningful and practical placements and ETE provision, which reduced the risk of reoffending, was not being maximised consistently. Unpaid work projects were making a significant contribution to local communities, however. I'll give some examples, and the first being the Canal and Rivers Trust, which is a national contract, and that's operating around 30 unpaid work projects across England and Wales. And they have a collective ambition to complete 300,000 hours of unpaid work over 3 years. And the estimated value of that work so far is considered to be about £2.5 million, which is a significant figure in today's economic climate. One of my favourite focus groups to lead whilst we were out on the inspection activity was the beneficiaries focus groups. So they were universally positive about the impact of unpaid work participation in the projects that they were running. We saw a school project. I think David and part of the team went to this particular project. They estimate that the participation of unpaid work had saved them around £1 million in maintenance and running costs for that particular school, which is hugely significant for their budget. And I was lucky enough to go to a women's project in Greater Manchester that is based in a community hub. And that is a project for women people on probation to take part in. They are responsible for setting up catering events at that community hub for local elderly residents. They do all of the setup, the catering, the serving, and all of the clean up as well at the end of that project. And the women come out of that with some recognisable accredited certification in things like food handling. Without them, those events could not happen. And that was made very clear to us by the leaders of those projects. And then in the North East, we spoke to a member of the local authority who was receiving support from unpaid work to address areas of antisocial behaviour, so where there were fly tipping and graffiti and things like that. And because of the budgetary restraints of that local authority, without the input of unpaid work participation, they would not be able to keep on top of those hotspots. And that was producing really tangible outcomes in terms of improved levels of community safety, less antisocial behaviour call-outs from the police, etc. And so there were really, really clear outcomes and benefits for that community. This doesn't happen by magic, and as David's already alluded to, one of the key drivers in terms of the success of placements is the unpaid work staff that run and deliver them. And 87% of user voice participants to the survey reported having really good relationships with unpaid work staff. Not only are they responsible for, getting a bus full of people to a particular location, but they have to mediate when things are not going particularly well within a group. They signpost individuals for onward support when necessary. They liaise between the individual and the practitioner and other professionals that are working with that person. And they listen to that individual. When I was in that women's placement in Greater Manchester, I overheard a conversation where one of the female participants was talking about regaining contact with her children. That unpaid work supervisor knew the names of those children and their ages, and she knew the journey that this woman had been on. And it was a really heartwarming and inspiring kind of conversation to overhear in terms of that relationship between supervisor and participant. However, in some of the placements that we did see, we had concerns about a lack of basic facilities available, not only to people on probation, but to the staff that were supervising them. We saw some placements without access to toilets, basic hand washing facilities, nowhere sanitary for people to eat their lunch or have a break. That is in breach of health and safety legislation in some instances, and clearly unacceptable for a modern workforce. Holly, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'll move in now to the recommendations from the report. I'm not going to read them out word for word, but I will go into some of them. As we've outlined, David has mentioned the risk profile of those that are subject to unpaid work can sometimes in some areas be up to 20% of high risk people. And regardless of risk, the attendees at unpaid work can present with a variety of challenging needs and behaviours. We therefore recommend that it's vital that decisions about placements are based in a solid foundation of risk assessment. So some of that stuff that David was talking about earlier on, about getting that placement right in the first instance, is incredibly important. Again, David's referred to the flexibility that regions have in determining how they operate their unpaid work provision, and that is responsive to local nuances, and that's important. But we did consistently see better performance where unpaid work was a priority within that model, and where the staff managing unpaid work had familiarity with the orders and what was required to manage them effectively. Whichever model is chosen by a region, those cultural perceptions of the value of unpaid work and the communication between practitioners and unpaid work staff are really central to the success of that model. Lots and lots of research tells us that employment is a really fundamental driver towards desistance for a lot of people. So maximising the quality of the ETE component of unpaid work and ensuring that this is accessible to everybody who receives unpaid work as a requirement could really support a reduction in reoffending and should be enhanced by the organisation as much as possible. We do acknowledge that there is a place for those punitive unpaid work activities such as litter picking and graffiti removal. But where unpaid work shone for us as an inspection team, participants were engaged in making meaningful reparation to their communities. The work that they were doing was really valued by the beneficiaries and the public, and the person on probation left unpaid work with a tangible outcome, whether that be some skills that they had developed or improved over that time, or a meaningful certificate or qualification that they could take forward into their employment journey. And we therefore recommend increasing the number of people that have access to those kinds of placements. And as referenced in the first recommendation, the risk profile of the unpaid work group can vary significantly from day to day. And as inspectors, we weren't really satisfied that the supervisors always had access to that comprehensive risk information that David has mentioned, so that they could easily reference that to support the management of the group or the individual behaviours that they were facing on a day-to-day basis. Given that they've got oversight on occasion of up to 8 people, often in remote circumstances, often where there are hazards available in the working environment, such as tools, for example, it really is vital that they do have good quality risk information at hand. Can I have the last slide for me, please, Holly? Thank you. When we spoke to unpaid work staff, they overwhelmingly told us that online training did not always meet their needs, and that often training had a sentence management focus that wasn't necessarily realistic in an unpaid work environment. We heard examples, as David has referenced, of very skills-based activities such as the management of aggression and violence, being delivered as e-learning rather than in a practical classroom experience. Given the risk profile that we've talked about around unpaid work groups, we do recommend that the development programme for supervisors and placement coordinators takes a much more risk-based focus, and that it considers the nuances of the unpaid work environment. We recommend that the arrangements for placing lone women in all male settings are reviewed. Sometimes that might be appropriate where there's been an open conversation with a female and she is happy to engage in that type of environment, and the woman might well be okay with it. A choice should obviously be given, but we did see examples where the contingencies in place to prevent that happening when it was unwanted were not necessarily robust enough, and so we do recommend that those arrangements are reviewed. It's not acceptable that any unpaid work placement fails to meet health and safety benchmarks. All placements need to be compliant with health and safety standards and legislation, and that subsequently become a recommendation of the report. And then finally, from me, as a team of inspectors, we were really impressed by the adaptations made to human factors in Wales to make it suitable for use in the world of unpaid work. Although it was met with some resistance initially, the staff were overwhelmingly positive about the approach. And as David mentioned, we did see it contribute to an increased focus on anticipating and managing the risk associated with unpaid work, improved communication between groups of staff, and an improved consideration of the well-being for unpaid work staff and the role that they do. So we consider that there is more merit in elements of this being explored more broadly across the organisation. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Chris now from User Voice for his part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Appreciate that. So, hi everyone, my name is Chris. I'm a research manager at User Voice, and I've led on the relationship between User Voice and HMI probation for the past 3 years now. I was on the ground myself for this consultation, speaking to people alongside our great team of lived experience peer researchers. I'm also the nerd behind the laptop that does all the data analysis, and I was the one that put the report together. So I hope you enjoy it when I share it later. I'd like to thank HMIP for the opportunity to represent the voice of people with experience of unpaid work for this inspection. Katie, one of our fantastic peer researchers, was supposed to speak today, but unfortunately she couldn't make it the last minute, so you're stuck with me for the last 10 minutes. Apologies. And yeah, so today I'm going to speak through the key findings of the report. The full report can be found on our website, and it's very much worth a read. As I said, I'll post a link to the report in the chat at the end of the session. Next slide, please. So in total, as David said earlier, we gave a voice to 1,020 people across 6 probation regions in England and Wales. Such a number is unprecedented, and it's something we're definitely proud of. This willingness to engage in such high numbers shows that people with lived experience want to have their voice heard, and when they do, they can make invaluable contributions that are key to the betterment of service provision. On the screen, you'll see a chart that covers all aspects of unpaid work experience we report on. All areas are key, but I will highlight specific areas in this presentation, such as the purpose of unpaid work in the eyes of people undertaking unpaid work and their relationship with unpaid work staff. The overall objective of the consultation was to better understand people's experience with unpaid work and whether it meets their needs. But further objectives were to understand what support people undertaking unpaid work have had, to understand whether people find their unpaid work to be punitive, rehabilitative, or reparative, and to understand if people develop skills that improve their employability or career opportunities, to understand how well organized activities are, and to highlight any good practice that can be built upon by the service. Next slide, please. So I understand there's a lot of data on the screen right now, and I implore you to go have a look at the, so it's there's a lot to take in, to go look at the report afterwards, to go with a fine-tooth comb. But the first key theme I want to highlight considers the need for a tailored approach to an individual's unpaid work order. In 2023 and 2024 alone, over 5,500 people have had their voice heard as a result of user voice consultations commissioned by HMI Probation on both their core and thematic programs. A tailored solution that runs through all inspections is the need for a tailored approach to supervision. This is the need for a supervisor or practitioner to take the time to understand the individual, their needs, and figure out how to better their rehabilitation. This is very much the case when it came to unpaid work. People told us that they want an individually tailored approach that works alongside their interests, skills, and their personal development. If you look at the left, less than half told us that the unpaid work activity takes their skills and interests into account. And if you look at the right, this varies significantly when it comes to when considering the activity. For example, like textiles was rated higher when it comes to matching skills and interests. So is charity work and woodwork. However, litter picking was by far the lowest, and allotment work wasn't too far behind. Next slide, please. So having a tailored approach does not only consider interests and personal development, but also other key aspects of an individual's life, such as employment, protected characteristics, and childcare, amongst others. Here are 2 quotes from people who struggled to fulfill their unpaid work orders for differing reasons. So on the left, the gentleman said, "I have 5 fractures and I shouldn't be doing manual labor. I should have retired when I was 65, but at 73, they gave me community work." How ridiculous is that? We're out here with big machines working so hard, they don't care. And then another individual told us, "Well, I run a business, and like I said, I see this as a punishment. I do have someone running a business for me. Probation on Friday to do a course, and I have 2.5 hours for work life. It's crippling me to do 2 days a week." The next slide, please, Holly. So as I mentioned earlier, a key aspect of what we wanted to find out was whether people thought unpaid work primarily a punitive, rehabilitative, or reparative measure, or which of these should be a priority for them. Interestingly, many people thought these weren't mutually exclusive, which also makes sense to me. More than 2 in 3 believe that unpaid work is mainly a form of punishment. Almost 3 in 4 believe that unpaid work helped them give back to society. And as you'll see on the left of the screen, just over half told us that their unpaid work helped their rehabilitation. Unsurprisingly, all 3 were dependent on the activity of the unpaid work. For example, on the rate you'll see that those rated highly in being rehabilitative were sports clubs, charity work, textiles, and a special shout out to gardening, which surprised me in how many people got a lot out of it compared to allotment work, which in my mind was quite simple. But for the people that I spoke to in Northumberland, I remember they're saying the issue with the allotment work is that a lot of the food was going to waste and it wasn't being utilized by local food banks in the community, and they feel like they get a lot more out of it personally and for the community if that was the case. The next slide, please. So here's what a couple of people said about unpaid work and rehabilitation. So the individual on the left said it should focus on rehabilitation 100 million%, because rehabilitation is what makes you not reoffend. And then the individual on the right, I actually think it does rehabilitate you, because if you do something bad, you go straight back to prison. Over here, you're working and you're busy and it keeps you out of trouble. I think it's changed me a little bit. Next slide, please. This speaks to what David and Helen mentioned during their presentations, but one of the most striking aspects of the findings was the quality of the relationship between people undertaking unpaid work and unpaid work staff. Almost 9 in 10 reported a good relationship with unpaid work staff. And as you can see on the right, this does vary depending on region, but no region was below 4 out of 5 people reporting a positive relationship, which is pretty impressive. So participants praised the attitude of the vast majority of unpaid work staff. People told us they felt respected and able to communicate openly with their supervisors, which allowed them to have meaningful conversations. Focus group participants told us that probation staff could learn a lot from unpaid work supervisors. According to the focus group participants, unpaid work staff were more friendly. They looked after the individuals, took more interest in them compared to their practitioners. I think a lot has to be said that people with lived experience with the justice system are more likely to be hired in the supervisor roles, which goes a long way breaking down barriers and improving overall experience. Personally, I work in an organisation that has 85% of its staff with lived experience with the justice system, and trust me, it's definitely something that works. Next slide, please. One such good relationship that led an individual to find full-time employment. This is an example that is included in our report with a case study of good practice that shows how supported mentorship can lead to employment, and in the words of the individual, a reason to get out of bed and a new motivation for life. I wish the individual himself could be here to tell his story, or even Casey, our peer researcher, who now speaks to him regularly. But here are a couple of paragraphs of his own words to paint a picture of when you get unpaid work right, can truly make a difference. I'm just going to read this, try to be very quick with it because I understand it's quite a lot of words. But my supervisor, Pete, he's an amazing guy who got me the job I'm in now. It was weird. One day I realized I was working for free, and when I told him, he asked if I could do it full time. I've never had a full-time job, so to be honest, I didn't really believe he could help. And in fact, I actually just didn't think he would want to help me like he has. No one has before, so why would he? But he did, and I'm here 6 months later and about to start a landscaping qualification. And he went on to say, I love it. It's a reason for me getting out of bed. It's my reason for keeping away from people who had helped me get into trouble. I'm not saying it wasn't my fault I ended up in court, but it definitely was, but the fact I was hanging around with people who are committing crimes on a daily basis did not help. This has helped me get a new set of mates down the pub with this lot. His colleagues, he's talking about on a Friday instead of what I used to do, which is why I landed in court. And the next and final slide, please, Holly. So to finish, I wanted to highlight some other key findings which are expanded on up in the full report. 7 in 10 people reported an overall positive experience whilst undertaking unpaid work. Those undertaking unpaid work in Wales have a better experience than those in England across pretty much all areas of unpaid work. This might have something to do with the human factors approach Helen spoke about, but obviously there's other factors at play too. People with protected characteristics such as neurodiverse conditions and disabilities generally reported a worse experience across all areas of unpaid work. Being picked up in a community payback branded vans and branded high visibility jackets are seen as an unnecessary tool to embarrass people. But personally, this was a big takeaway for me. I heard it firsthand from people. For example, they had people they know driving past when they were painting fences, and And what they were relaying to me, and my understanding of it now, is that embarrassing people does not work, only isolates the individual and can ruin community ties. I think people should be supported rather than embarrassed in that regard. So. And finally, just over half told us that their unpaid work improves their self-esteem. But as expected, this does vary depending on the quality of the unpaid work activity. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. I'll share the report in the chat alongside my email address if anybody wants to reach out. Also happy to answer any questions at the end of the session. So thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Helena Moore and I'm the Effective Practice Lead within the organisation. So we did publish an Effective Practice Guide as part of this thematic. And as you can see on the slide there, it's just a bit of an overview of what is included in the guide. And we have shared examples of leadership and governance. We've shared quite a few examples of unpaid work placements that we've highlighted as effective, and that forms the main part of the guide. We've also shared some case studies around engagement strategies. And we've also shared some examples of training that we found particularly effective, and I'm going to talk to you about those today as well within my presentation. Next slide, please, Holly. So in terms of navigating the guide, it is intended that you would use it as a toolkit, or some people might read it from cover to cover, but there is the option that you can navigate to the sections of interest using the contents page. But you'll also see these little vectors, these little images there, which will signpost you to other things such as tools for practitioners. And particularly in this guide, there's a further reading section where there's lots of useful links related to academic insights, research pages and things like that, which might be of interest. We've also got a clip within the guide where we've spoke to a beneficiary, a local councillor and an unpaid work coordinator for one of the placement examples. And it's a lovely reflection on the work that they've found the people on probation did for them and what their feelings around that was. So that's really worth a watch. You'll also see some opportunities for reflection within the guide. So usually at the end of sections, you'll just see a few kind of stop and think kind of reflection questions to give you the opportunity to kind of think about what the learning points from the example were and, what it is that you maybe want to take forward within your areas. So we do hope you find the Effective Practice Guide useful. Next slide, please. Thanks, Holly. So as already been mentioned, we have included the human factors model in the unpaid work effective practice guide also. So as most of you will know, the human factors model has been in operation in Wales for a number of years now, and it is now embedded across all departments within the organisation. But what we did see was the adapted model for unpaid work. So the image on the slide there does show you the kind of the elements of the human factors model. And if you're not familiar with that, there is a lot more information within the effective practice guide. But for unpaid work teams, what we saw was that managers will meet on a morning as part of their team briefings, and they'll go through anything that's present for the day or anything from the night before that's been raised by unpaid work teams, and they'll kind of do that as part of their the model's routine. But to manage the complexities of the unpaid work teams, the supervisors, the administrators and the coordinators, they actually hold their team meetings in an afternoon. So as you know, supervisors will be out early in the morning and they'll be out on site all day. And also often these teams can be quite remote and diverse because of the nature of the work. And what we found was that staff found this experience really positive, and it really made them feel like there was investment in them as a team, and also strengthened the relationships between them and the sentence management teams. So it really fostered a culture of kind of that risk awareness across all departments and improved the communication. So you can see the quote there is from one of the supervisors, and they've talked about how the meetings allowed them to offload about the day. They can exchange risk information, but they can either also deal with practical things like equipment issues, van issues, all that type of thing that is applicable to unpaid work, but also an opportunity to share successes as well. So it was received really positively. So we did find this was an effective example of the team self-managing their risks and issues. It was developing their leadership skills and coming together as that team, and also strengthening those connections. Next slide, please. So within the guide, there are a few examples of placements, and I've highlighted 3 here. And the first one is a therapeutic inclusion placement at Rhubarb Farm in Nottingham. So this was a really, really lovely site, a large site where it really did have a therapeutic feel. Now, the activities included grown vegetables, poultry for eggs, tending to animals, you know, things like that. And also the produce would then go on to be sold in food banks, or they had kind of like a bag library where you would pay a certain amount of money to for a bag, and you would fill it up with all the produce, and that was in the local area. There was also an emphasis on developing skills and confidence and improving health and well-being, and there was a lot of opportunities to attend therapeutic workshops and art therapy and budgeting classes and things like that as well. Now, they offered individual and group placements for men and women on probation. And what was also unique about this placement was it also supported other groups from the community. So there would be a diverse range of people in attendance. So it could be those who are unemployed, those who are in recovery, young people who are not in education and training, and those with disabilities. So everybody was referred to as volunteers on the site, and there was no identification of anybody's background or why they were there, which really made it feel inclusive. They were also keen to develop the talents of people that attended. So if there was someone attending who was an electrician or a welder, they would absolutely support using those skills, because there was a lot of maintenance to be done on the site. But also there was an example where a photographer wanted to kind of develop their talents, and they did some kind of promotional work as well. So that was a really nice example. So we did speak to two people from probation who were there, and we really got the sense of a really friendly, comfortable, safe place to be. And one individual talked about how they suffered from social anxiety, and they wouldn't even leave the house at one point, but now they were attending 3 days a week and were looking to look for some employment. So that was really, really positive here. Now, at Pavilion Park in Cardiff, this is the example I mentioned earlier where we had the interview with the beneficiary and the unpaid work coordinator. So again, another large site that was really overgrown, it was disused, and it was actually attracting antisocial behaviour. So the unpaid work teams went in there and completed a lot of manual work, ground maintenance, gardening, planting and things like that. And there really was some excellent feedback regarding that. And you can actually read a newspaper article within the Effective Practice Guide as well, which highlights the work. But for this site in particular, there was a real strong sense of kind of mutual respect between people on probation and the beneficiaries and the coordinators. And the beneficiary talked really fondly about the work and that was being completed, but also would do things like bring crates of cans of pop in the summer, so the people on probation weren't getting hot and they had, you know, hydration, just as a way of saying thank you really for the work that they were doing. This example also speaks to the user voice research in terms of having something meaningful to do with their placements. And you can see from the example there, someone talked about how it made them feel really proud that the work was getting noticed. And that was not just by the beneficiaries, it was by the community. And they felt like they were doing something for a good cause, which really motivated them to get on with their hours and, you know, work really hard on the site. Now, the hub's already been mentioned by Helen, and we've highlighted it in the Effective Practice Guide also. And again, this was a women's placement. It was small groups and it was supervised by a female officer. And as Helen actually is reflected in her piece in the presentation, this particular unpaid work supervisor was really attentive to the female's needs, understood the needs, was really flexible in terms of childcare, etc., to ensure that people could get their hours completed. The other things included that the women were given a hot meal while they were at the placement, and the women also appreciated the rehabilitative ethos when they were there. And for those females who really showed commitment and motivation, they were offered the City and Guilds qualification in food hygiene. And it was great to hear examples where people had gone on to gain employment from the skills and the qualification that they'd gained from that placement. But also you can see from the quote as well, it wasn't just about those skills, it was the softer things around confidence and social inclusion that also supported them moving forward to seek employment. Next slide, please. And just to share the two examples of training that we found on the inspection. So At Snibston Colliery, that was a site in the East Midlands, we heard from the beneficiary that when the unpaid work team first went in, the quality of the work wasn't quite what they'd hoped for in terms of the standards. So what they did was invite the unpaid work supervisors to a full day event where they took them around the site and they trained them in maintenance and, you know, gardening and how to look after trees in a particular way. And those skills and knowledge were then passed on to the people on probation. And it was actually really lovely to then speak to the people on probation who were then telling us that they were then sharing those skills and knowledge with their families even. So it was a really good example of improving standards, but also really enhancing the offer of unpaid work where we could see that that knowledge was being passed on. And then finally, in the Northeast, we heard about some risk assessment workshops. So the accredited programs team had already developed these, and what they identified was that there was a gap in confidence and knowledge from the unpaid work colleagues. So what they did was kind of adapt the training so it was more relevant and meaningful for the unpaid work teams, and they offered again full day face-to-face sessions to bridge that gap and also develop their knowledge. And they also invited a police officer to come and talk to them around sex offender registration, which was a big gap for the people who were attending. And again, there's a quote there where you can see that a practitioner had found that really beneficial, but particularly that additional input around sex offender registration and what that really meant for people. So we felt that was a really good example of the head of interventions really leveraging their staff from one part of the organisation to upskill another. So I could talk all day about the effective practice examples, but I'm not going to. But I would really encourage you to have a look at the guide that's on our website. And in the meantime, I'll hand you back to Martin. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Helen. I'm really grateful to everybody for listening so carefully to that presentation, which I think was a real sort of tour de force of what we found as part of the unpaid work thematic inspection. Really grateful to David and Helen for that comprehensive view of what they found on the ground, which identified some really good work that is taking place, but also areas that we might need to look for improvement in future. I think the contribution from user voice, I'm really, really grateful to Chris for giving us his presentation and the voice of people on probation and their feedback, which I think is a real lesson for us. And finally, I really do commend to people the Effective Practice Guide, which gives us a real opportunity to shine a light on some of the very good practice that is taking place out there that has the capacity to make a real difference in relation to people on probation, their experience, but also for local communities as well. Now, we have had a Q&A running on the sidebar for people to have the opportunity to ask any questions. I haven't yet seen anybody posting a question other than saying, will the slides be available after the call, which they will be, unless I'm missing my reading of that. So if anybody's got any immediate questions, do feel free to raise your hand and the team or I will have a crack at answering your questions. And if not, I may pep it up by asking a couple of questions of the team myself.
So Martin, we've actually had one question from Lynn. It's quite a long question. So Lynn, if you feel free to put your hand up and you can read it out yourself, or I can read it. That's absolutely fine. Oh, she's here. There you go.
I'm here. Yeah. Morning, everybody. Hi.
Morning.
It's really around the ETE and the purpose of the unpaid work requirement and to what extent the unpaid work requirement can meet employment need. And should that be via a RAR? I've also made reference to the tension with negative press that there's been around, you know, this concept that they're working from home. Some of the judiciary don't like it. They believe that unpaid work should be punishment only. So I was just interested in the inspectorate's view, really.
Thanks, Lynn. I think it's a really good question. David, Helen, do you want to have a first crack at that? And then I'll add an end word in relation to any other observations from me.
So I think Helen was going to have a go first. Then I'm going to have a crack, and then we're going to come to you for the political answer as well, because I think it is a really political question. But good to see you, Lynn, and thanks again for all the help you gave me over the last 12 months.
No problem.
Helen.
Thank you. Yeah. So just to say, Lynn, we did interview several sentences over the course of the inspection, and I think you're right. I would say that probably the majority of them do view unpaid work as a punitive element and had some thoughts around the delivery of ET, but by not all means 100% of them felt that way. And several of them did view it as an opportunity for people to develop their skills and to enhance their employability moving forward. For me personally, I think that the unpaid work requirement should play a role in that skills improvement for onward employment. It's a very practical means of developing skills rather than a RAR, which may be more sort of theoretical or classroom based. It's an opportunity for somebody to go out into a team environment and practice those softer skills that come with being employed, as well as just the actual having a certificate at the end of it. And for many people on probation, they have never experienced that work environment. So from that point of view, it's a really good opportunity for them to practice some of that. So that would be sort of my view. I think it does play a role and should play a role moving forward. And in terms of the online offer, again, there does need to be that digital literacy is a really important part of being employed in most professions these days, and it's an opportunity for people to practice in that forum. And if there is going to be a more of a focus on those online courses providing something recognisable to employers, then again, I think that would be a real benefit for the unpaid work requirement to provide for people on probation. David, is there anything you want to add to that?
I would just say, I think it's a good question, and you're right. When we met sentences, because we did meet sentences, I don't think I put it up on the methodology, but in every region, they're very, very clear. It's unpaid work is punishment, and I think it's even in statute that it's written or referred to as punishment, or certainly in legislation. And I think the rehabilitation which has taken place, or rehabilitation or skilling would be a better phrase, upskilling has taken place under the umbrella that this is punishment, but there's also a little bit of skill thing. I mean, in terms of the political environment, just generally, I think realistically to change it or you refer to it as rehabilitation instead of punishment might undermine the confidence sentences the public have in it, and might, if we're looking for the sentencing review, I would imagine they'll still want to see it primarily as punishment. But at the same time, what's happened is skill development and constructive activity has taken place. I wouldn't say discreetly, because I think it's been quite overt, but it's been built into that as a punishment. So that's how I would see it continuing. When I came into it, into the inspection again, I was really enthused and by the potential here for rehabilitation. I've got to say, I think the user voice feedback speaks volumes, but I think we've got to keep it primarily as a punishment. Now, where it fits with RAR is interesting, because I'm speaking for myself now, but the activity we saw in terms of rehabilitation going on unpaid work is far more impressive than a lot of the RAR activity I've seen on core inspections. In fact, RAR activity tends to be limited and not seen through. Whether there can be a link, because if you have got good skills or good links with local colleges going on in unpaid work, whether RAR requirements can be linked into that as well, rather than have work in silos, I would question that. But I think overall it's still got my view would it has to be punishment with the skills underneath that. But I can see why RAR might be linked into that, because there's such good work going on. I hope I'm sitting on the fence a bit, but I'm very clear that having been through this inspection, punishment's got to stay in the title. I'm going to ask Martin. He might have a better political answer than me, but that's my answer at the moment.
Lynn, do you want to come in with an observation, and then I'll come in with an end point, and hopefully sort of wrap it all up?
I think my observation is we are right on the cusp right now of revising our strategy for ETE on unpaid work, and it's how far do we push now, because we have so many opportunities to link the people on unpaid work in with face-to-face opportunities. There are so many providers out there that secure jobs once they've been through training packages. There's a whole world that we could explore, but it's that tension. and it's getting that line right, and that's the bit that that's where we're at currently.
Lynn, I'm glad I let you in first, because it allows me to sort of wrap it up, hopefully, for you. So absolutely, you know, community sentences are punishment, and unpaid work, I think, is the very visible part of that. And ultimately, people are, spending their time for free doing work for the community as part of that. But what I think is really interesting about this thematic, and the reason why I was really excited to reach the end of it and reach the conclusions, it's also much more than that. And that's, I think, what we need to draw out nationally in our conversations with the public, but also with the judiciary as well. I think is really telling, actually, some of the feedback from Chris's user voice work in relation to the sort of how do people feel about this. And of course, it's absolutely true to say that, somebody doing litter picking is punishment. Yes, of course it is. But actually, is there opportunities to get more out of this? And I think that's where we need to move this conversation on. And certainly what I would say as Chief Inspector of Probation, I see that as part of my role in talking to the judges about this, in the base of trying to open their minds to maybe being a little bit more imaginative in relation to what it can give back to communities, but also around rehabilitation and the opportunity to change people. And the really stuff that really warmed me from Chris's feedback is the opportunities to sort of give people to do something positive and feel proud of the work that they have done. And of course, they've been punished, but ultimately our primary aim should be to ensure that those people turn their lives around and are not sort of circling around in the system. So I'm meeting with the senior judges next week, and this is one of the things that I'm going to be talking to them about, Lynn, and more power to your elbow in relation to, I think there's a real opportunity to get the balance right going forward and be much more imaginative about how we use the various different requirements available us to meet the overall needs. And I think there's more that should be done to ensure that we shine a light on the fantastic work that is taking place, even if, of course, as an inspector, we'll always identify areas for improvement. I think there's much more that we can do to highlight the fantastic work that's taking place and the opportunity it provides. I hope that helps, and we'll carry on the conversation.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Perfect. We have at least, I think, got two hands up now. Matthew, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Matt Simpson. I'm head for South Central. I just was really interested in hearing some of that feedback, and I was really pleased to see some specific comments around the L&D offer to our frontline staff. I just wonder, it's a bit of just an open question, really. I think there's a number of us feel that this is one of the real opportunities for the unified service to look at our L&D provision. I just wondered if you felt there were similar opportunities to improve it, because it's depending on where you're at as a region, it can be really fragmented, really inefficient, and there feels like this is a chance that we could really do much better. That's just an observation, really.
David, you're already off mute.
Hi, Matthew. Good to see you.
Hi.
No, I agree, and we have got the training inspection coming out, and I know that highlights queries about the training, but I think you used word fragmented then. I think it is fragmented, and I think that particularly unpaid work staff and the role they play, that the training offer isn't sufficient at the moment. I hope it's an opportunity not just to unify the training, but also to I wouldn't say unify, but to integrate more that whole importance of unpaid work into the delivery of the of probation generally. I mean, it's always been said, hasn't it? Unpaid work. As soon as there's a minister coming down, everyone's sent out on an unpaid work project. But then in between, because it is something tangible, it is something visual, and I just think for me, you've got public protection and unpaid work, and it strikes me as that they are the two most important arms of probation in terms of rehabilitation and in terms of the role we play. And I suppose so. I hope this report contributes to that. And I certainly, in terms of the learning and training, we have highlighted it. I think there's a real gap there. I think we said it quite clearly. I think in terms of we in terms of that, on one level, I understand why people want to risk management as a role for sentence managers is actually has got to be a whole service role. And you know, it was a surprise. We went to one region and it wasn't yours, and we asked how many MAPA cases have you got on the unpaid work caseload, and literally they weren't able to tell us, and actually the staff didn't even know which were MAPA cases and which weren't. And I think that's a huge omission. So I think that whole training, that whole way of integrating what is a key fundamental of service delivery needs to be, I hope this contributes to that.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, David. And I just add as a postscript to that, Matthew, we all know that the probation service needs to retain more people, recruit more people as part of that. And I guess my reflection is part of that is about pay, but we know that's difficult. In my experience of 30 years, the really important thing that keeps people working for an organisation is they believe in the work and they feel invested in and appreciated by their employer. And I think that's part of the offer here. Is I think a huge amount more can be done to ensure those people understand the really important contribution they make to the work of the probation service and that they feel invested in. And I think if we can do more building on the back of our recruitment, retention and training thematic along those lines, I think we'd gradually start to make a difference on some of the problems that we have in relation to staff turnover. I think we just need to keep up. You know, this is vital work, and one of the things that I've been saying consistently to people is a lot of attention has been on our prisons for understandable reasons, but if we really want to affect change in our communities in terms of reoffending, we have to get it right on probation. So I would say the probation service is the most important part of the work within HMPPS, because of course you can lock people up, but ultimately everybody's coming out at some point, but also probation is important in relation to keeping people from going into prison as part of that as well. So that's the message I'm banging on about, but of course I'm Chief Inspector of Probation, I would say that, wouldn't I? Fantastic. Janet, I'm going to ask you to come in next. I think you're on mute, Janet.
Hello, my name's Janet Carter. I'm a retired legal advisor in the Magistrates Court. So something a little bit different. As a barrister as well, I think one of the pieces of legislation to do with unpaid work is this one, that every single person on a community order is required to have a requirement for the purpose of punishment. Case law has wiped it down to unpaid work, curfew, alcohol monitoring. So my feeling has always been, because this has been with us since the Chris Grayling years, 2013, very memorable, and the big push then was every order has got to have this punishment element. And I've sat in court watching magistrates angsting over adding in unpaid work for people who really should just have been getting a RA days. They just needed rehabilitation, and it really tags on the point made earlier about that kind of rubbing point between unpaid work and RA days, that if you're wanting to help, if you're wanting to increase employability, maybe RA days was the right answer. But the law says you've got to have flipping unpaid work, curfew or alcohol monitoring. And it's very tricky under the legislation to wriggle out of that. You've got to stick on a fine, which people cannot afford, or there has to be something exceptional, which is difficult to find if someone is actually suitable. So I guess my question is it time that we got rid of that legislation and said, unpaid work is for punishment, there may be rehabilitative spin-offs, but we shouldn't be placing people who desperately, vulnerable people very often, who cannot cope with the discipline of unpaid work, being forced into it because of an outdated attitude in 2013. We just need rid of it.
Janet, what a brilliant question. Now, Helen, you've got your hand up, and I missed the fact that you'd put your hand up previously. Why don't you have a go at this first, and then I might add a last-minute confession after you've answered the question.
I'll probably hedge my bets and stay clear of a definitive answer about whether we should scrap the legislation, Janet. But what I would say is, we did see examples where people were placed on unpaid work inappropriately, where they were never going to be able to complete it because of a range of vulnerabilities and personal challenges that they had. And And, you know, we would always advocate for that to be considered at the point of sentencing, and sentencing recommendations to be appropriate and suitable and taking in those factors into account. However, we also did see examples where people had a range of difficulties, disabilities, vulnerabilities, and there were some really creative, reasonable adjustments made to support and facilitate unpaid work. And we saw things such as one-to-one workshops, at home working, although that had declined following the COVID period. And so I think there is something to be said about not having a one-size-fits-all approach to this, and to be able to respond to the nuances that an individual comes with, and to find what their strengths can be and what they can do, in a way of allowing them to do that reparation piece and to develop themselves individually as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. I'll add my confession now. I was responsible for the Crime and Courts Act 2013, which introduced the punitive requirement, Janet. So I had to confess that quite early on. You see, the sins of the past. But as Chief Inspector of Probation, independent of government rather than narrow an MOJ policy official, I think you're probably right. I mean, I think the overemphasis on punishment is probably what has got us into some of the murky waters that we're currently in. And I also think if you go right back to the drawing board, I think any punishment ordered by the court, whatever the sort of returns of that, are arguably punitive in some way on the basis that people have to carry out that order as part of it. So maybe it's time, and maybe it's something that I've already responded to the sentencing review with some thoughts on some of the things that should be changed, including reversing other changes that I made when I was head of sentencing policy at the time. Maybe this is one of them. It's a good spot, Janet, and don't feel at all that it was. I think it's a really good observation. Thank you. Chris, do you want to come in, and then I might go back to Janet because she might want to give me another beating.
Yeah, personally, I couldn't agree with you more, Janet. It's I think such a focus on punishment may be reflected in the societal views at the time in 2013, and they may even reflect the societal views now, and that's probably why perspective. Because me, the criminal justice has been part of my life throughout my entire life through family members and other aspects. But what's been clear to me is through that experience and having researched in the criminal justice system for well over 3 years now, is that what makes society safer is rehabilitation. So punishment, I don't think, is making society safer. And if that's, they should be making society safer and the development of the individual, that should be the focus. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Thanks, Chris. Janet, anything you wanted to say by way of any response to that?
No, I feel warmed. I feel warmed by your idea that you might do something about it, because it's one of these, it's like a crazy thing that persists. And I can also say, in some parts of the country, they take it a lot more seriously than others. And you can see that. Overloaded orders for vulnerable people need to stop. Benefits of unpaid work with the rehabilitation, absolutely thumbs up. But for the people where the purpose is actually punishment primarily, not for those where it's rehabilitation that's required. And as you rightly say, RA days, there are enough restriction on liberty, particularly if you require a lot of RA days. It's, you know, that is your restriction on liberty. It's cracked now.
Perfect. Janet, I mean, I guess the bit that I would move towards is ultimately you've got to trust the sentencer to get the right sentence for the circumstances of the case of that, what, depending on, you know, whether they've been, you know, a 19-year-old man who's had a bit of a punch up outside the and he might need to be punished for that versus somebody who's extremely vulnerable. I completely agree with that. And I think probably there's a way to, you know, certainly I think there's 5 purposes of sentencing, and punishment is just one of them, and I think it's almost become too big within that. So certainly something to be picked out. I can see there are some other questions, Holly, but I can't find them. Can you guide me to whether there's any further questions?
Oh, Jane Port has just added a comment. Sometimes people do not know that they are capable of doing something like unpaid work until they are engaged, motivated, and empowered to do it. It's persistence in action. So thank you, Jane, for that comment. I can't see any more questions.
Oh, okay.
Unless,
well, in that case, I think we're 30 seconds ahead of time. I am so grateful to everybody for joining us and asking such interesting questions. And I'm particularly grateful for the people from the inspectorate that have actually given some good answers to the questions and taken us through the findings. I think it's a tremendously important and really detailed piece of work that was led by David and Helen and the inspection team beneath that. The effective practice guide, as I say, and do read it. It's some fantastic stuff in there. And finally, Chris, the impact of user voice on this and getting the voice of people on probation, really crucial, really sort of gave us additional insight in relation to what's going on. But thank you so much for attending. I look forward to seeing you at a future one of these events, and enjoy your Fridays. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.